It's crazy, right? How many rappers end up in legal trouble? It's like hip hop and the justice system are like tied together somehow.
Yeah. It's a pattern you can't ignore, for sure. So today we're going to do a deep dive into that, why it is, especially why so many black artists seem to face way harsher
You
consequences.
always hear about these rappers getting locked up, and it feels like so often the punishment doesn't fit the crime. So like where do we even start with all this?
Well, let's start with some big cases that really show the problem, like you got C murder, he's serving life for a murder, but get this, witnesses have actually like recanted their statements.
Wow.
Then you got Ralo, he's facing 8 years for marijuana trafficking, even though, a lot of states are legalizing it.
Right.
And then, you got Lil Durk, he's looking at a possible life sentence for charges connected to a murder for hire plot.
Okay, so I mean right away, we're talking serious charges here and potentially really long sentences. But why? Why does it seem like the feds are coming down so hard on rappers? What's the deal with the federal system?
Well, it all comes down to the federal sentencing guidelines. It's basically this set of rules that like controls how they decide on punishments. Think of it like I don't know, like a recipe for sentencing. But the ingredients are things like how serious the crime is, the amount of drugs involved, if any, and someone's past criminal history, stuff like that.
So it's less about like the judge looking at each case individually and more about like just plugging stuff into a formula.
Pretty much, yeah. And one of the worst parts is these mandatory minimums. They're like these preset sentences for certain crimes, and judges, they don't have much wiggle room, even if they think the punishment's like way too harsh.
Wait, so even if a judge thinks a sentence is crazy, they have to like go with it anyway? That doesn't seem right.
Yeah, it's one of the most controversial parts of the system for sure. And to make it worse, the federal system doesn't have parole, so whatever sentence you get, you're serving like at least 85% of it, no matter how much you rehabilitate yourself.
Wow, so it's like you're already starting off with a disadvantage. It's like you're playing a game with like rigged rules.
Yeah, and then you add RICO laws too, and it gets even more messed up.
RICO, like the Racketeer Influence and Corrupt Organizations Act. I thought that was for like mobsters, not rappers.
Yeah, well, it was originally meant for organized crime, but they've been using it more and more against rappers and their crews. The problem is, prosecutors can use RICO to go after people just because of who they know, not really because of, like, hard evidence.
So you're saying you can get serious time just for being associated with the wrong people, even if you didn't personally do anything wrong?
Exactly. And they can use things like song lyrics, social media posts, basically anything they can twist to say you're part of a criminal enterprise. And that brings us to why black artists get hit harder.
Okay, I mean, this is where it gets interesting, right? Why are they seemingly targeted more?
Well, it's a bunch of factors, but it starts with this thing called selective prosecution. Basically, who gets charged with what isn't always fair. Studies show that prosecutors often go harder on black individuals, especially when it comes to drugs and like gang-related stuff.
So even if the laws themselves aren't like racist, the way they're used can be?
Right, and then you combine that with the mandatory minimums we talked about and the broad reach of RICO laws, you create this system that really hits black artists hard. It's like this I don't know, perfect storm of injustice.
And to bring it back to the cases we were talking about, like, how does this actually work in the real world? Take Ralo, for example. He got 8 years for marijuana. It just seems way too much.
Well, his case is a good example of how federal drug laws and those mandatory minimums can lead to like crazy sentences. Even though public opinion on marijuana is changing, the feds haven't really caught up. And those mandatory minimums, they're still there.
So you can still get locked up by the feds even if weed's legal in your state? That's wild. What about those mandatory minimums, though? Like, how do they actually work?
Okay, it's like you're baking a cake and the recipe says you have to use like 5 cups of sugar. Even if you know it'll be way too sweet, you got to follow the recipe, right? That's what mandatory minimums are like for judges.
So they're forced to give these really harsh sentences, even if they think it's like totally overkill.
Exactly. And remember, there's no parole in the federal system, so you're serving almost all that time no matter what.
Man, this is heavy stuff. I'm starting to see how this system can really trap people.
And it's also really important to understand how past convictions play into all of this. This whole career criminal label is another way the system can really slam the door on someone, especially with federal sentencing.
So if you have a record, you're automatically a career criminal.
Not automatically, but they use that label pretty easily, especially if you've got multiple convictions in the past.
Okay, so let's say someone does have a record. How does that affect what sentence they get in federal court?
Well, first off, it can lead to what they call enhanced sentences. So if you're convicted of a new crime and they consider you a career criminal, you're looking at a way longer sentence than someone without that record, even for the same crime.
That doesn't seem right at all. It's like you're being punished twice for the same thing.
That's what a lot of people who want to reform the justice system argue. They say it goes against the whole point of rehabilitation. and it creates this cycle that's really hard to break out of.
It's like a scarlet letter you can never really escape from. But how does this specifically connect to rappers? It's not like it only applies to them, right?
True, but when you think about the biases we've been talking about, it's clear why they're affected more often. Remember, they're more likely to be targeted by police, charged with more serious stuff, and less likely to have good lawyers.
So it's like all these parts of the system are working together to create this disadvantage for black artists.
Exactly, and that career criminal label is just another tool they use. It's a way to justify those harsh punishments, the longer sentences, and keep people stuck in the system.
This is a lot to take in. It's starting to feel like the whole system is working against certain people right from the start.
And it's a valid feeling, and it's important to remember this isn't just about like abstract legal stuff. This is about real people's lives. We're talking about talented artists, sons, fathers, brothers who are getting locked up for years, sometimes decades, because of a system that's messed up and biased.
Yeah, you're right. It's easy to get caught up in the legal terms and everything, but this is about people's lives and the impact these injustices have on them, their families, their communities. It's sad.
It really is, and that's why it's so important to keep talking about this, to challenge how things are, and demand better from our justice system.
We can't let these stories get lost in the headlines and the numbers. We need to remember the human side of this and see the real cost of these injustices.
Couldn't agree more. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave you with something to think about. In a system that often targets people based on who they know, not solid evidence, who's really responsible for the crimes? Is it just the individual, or is there something bigger going on?
That's a really powerful question. It makes you think about what justice really means and how much is individual responsibility versus the system itself. And it's a question we all need to think about as we try to build a more fair and just society.
It's like hip hop is all about like crews, labels, representing where you're from, creative identity. But with RICO, that sense of community, it can be twisted into like proof of a criminal enterprise.
That's scary. So just being part of a group, even if you're not actually doing anything illegal, can get you in trouble.
That's the thing with RICO, and it gets even worse when you think about all the stereotypes about rap music and black culture, like prosecutors can take lyrics, social media posts, whatever, out of context and make it look like criminal activity, even if the evidence is weak.
So they're kind of using the music and the culture itself against the artists.
Yeah, kind of, and it plays into this whole like societal fear of black men, the idea that they're all dangerous and violent. It's this messed up story that keeps getting told over and over, especially in the media.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? They get targeted because of these stereotypes, and then when they do end up in trouble, it just reinforces the bias.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to see that this isn't just about individual cases, It's about how these laws and how they do things and contribute to like mass incarceration, especially in black community. It's a systemic problem rooted in like years and years of racial bias and discrimination.
So we're talking about a system that's stacked against black artists from the get-go, with like selective prosecution, mandatory minimums, and RICO laws, all working together to create this cycle of injustice. But are there any, like, real-world examples of how this compares to, say, white-collar criminals?
Oh, absolutely. You see this contrast all the time. Think about, like, corporate execs who commit fraud or, steal millions of dollars. They often get off way easier than someone like Ralo, who got caught with marijuana.
Seriously. So a guy selling weed gets 8 years, but a CEO who steals millions might just get a fine or probation.
Yeah, it happens more than you think. White-collar criminals, they usually have the best lawyers, they can afford to make deals, and the justice system generally sees them as less of a threat.
That's messed up. It's like there are two different systems of justice, one for the rich and powerful and another for everyone else.
That's a good point. It really highlights the deeper problem of systemic bias and how it affects everything in our society, including the legal system.
It's like this unspoken hierarchy of crime, where the crimes committed by people in power are seen as less serious, even when the damage they cause is much greater.
Exactly. It's a dangerous double standard. It keeps inequality going and undermines the whole idea of justice.
Okay, so we've talked about RICO laws, mandatory minimums, and how white-collar criminals often get lighter sentences compared to black artists. But there's another part of this we haven't really dug into, the whole career criminal label and how that affects sentencing.
Right, we touched on it before, but yeah, let's go deeper into how this label can really trap people in a cycle of punishment, especially when it comes to federal sentencing.
So break it down for me. What makes someone a career criminal in the eyes of the law?
Well, it's not like a set rule or anything, but generally, if you have a bunch of prior convictions, especially felonies, they can label you a career criminal.
And what happens if you get that label? What are the consequences?
Well, like we said before, it can mean much harsher sentences, even for stuff that's not that serious. It's like the system is saying, because you made mistakes before, you can't change and you deserve to be punished more.
That just doesn't seem fair. It's like you're always being judged for your past, even if you did your time and tried to turn your life around.
Exactly. It goes against the whole point of giving people a second chance. Rehabilitation. It's like they assume once a criminal, always a criminal.
But how does this target black artists specifically? It's not like only they get labeled this way, right?
True, but when you add in all the systemic biases we've been talking about, it becomes pretty clear why black artists are affected more. They're already more likely to be targeted by the police, more likely to be charged with serious stuff, and less likely to have good lawyers.
So it's like all these parts of the system are working together to put black artists at a disadvantage.
Exactly. And the career criminal label is just another tool they use to justify tougher punishments, longer sentences, and basically keep people stuck in the system.
Man, this is heavy stuff. It feels like the whole system is rigged against certain people from the beginning.
It's a valid feeling, for sure, and it's important to remember that this isn't just about abstract legal concepts. This is about real people. We're talking about talented artists, sons, fathers, brothers, being locked up for years, sometimes decades, because of a system that's broken and biased.
You're right, it's easy to get lost in the legal jargon and all that. But at the end of the day, this is about people's lives and how these injustices impact them, their families, their communities. It's heartbreaking.
Absolutely, and that's why we got to keep talking about this, keep challenging the status quo, and demand better from our justice system.
We can't let these stories get buried under all the headlines and statistics. We have to remember the human side of this and understand the real cost of these injustices.
I couldn't agree more. So we're about to wrap up this part of our deep dive, but I want to leave you with this. In a system that often goes after people based on who they're associated with, not hard evidence, who's really to blame for the crimes? Is it just the person, or is there a bigger problem at play?
That's a deep question. It really makes you think about the whole idea of justice and how much is personal responsibility versus the system itself. We all need to think about that as we try to build a fairer and more just society. It really does. It makes you wonder, like, if the system's designed to kind of set people up for failure, can we really put all the blame on them? You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's tricky. It makes us look at some hard truths about, our own biases. Are we really about second chances and rehabilitation, or are we just more comfortable locking people up and, forgetting about them?
That's a tough one, but it's something we have to ask ourselves. If we really want a more just and compassionate society, and it goes back to this whole systemic bias thing, right? It's not just about, like, individual prejudice. It's about how the whole system, the laws, are set up to keep inequality going.
Absolutely. And one of the clearest examples is how the justice system treats like street level crimes, the ones we see in black and brown communities compared to white collar crimes, the kind committed by people with power and privilege.
That's interesting. We've been talking about how black artists get caught up in the system, but we haven't really touched on how white-collar criminals often seem to get lighter sentences, even when they've caused, like, massive financial damage or even put people's lives at risk.
It's a total double standard, right? Like, think about it. A rapper gets caught with a little bit of drugs and faces years in prison, but a CEO who defrauds investors out of millions might get a slap on the wrist, a fine they can easily afford, or maybe house arrest in their mansion.
It's like there's this, like, unspoken ranking of crimes where the ones committed by wealthy, powerful people are seen as not as bad, like less deserving of punishment.
And that's the sneaky thing about systemic bias. It shapes how we see things, our laws, how we react to crime. It reinforces the power structures that are already there and keeps inequality going.
So it's not just about individual bad guys, right? It's about how the whole system is built to protect certain people while punishing others.
Exactly. And that's why we can't just focus on individual cases. We need to reform the whole system, address what causes crime, invest in communities, and create a justice system that actually lives up to its name. One that's fair, equal, and focuses on rehabilitation, not just punishment.
That's a powerful goal. It's going to take a lot of work to get there. But I think, like, step one is just admitting there's a problem. Recognize that systemic bias exists, and being willing to have these tough conversations.
Totally agree. We can't fix what we don't acknowledge, right? And the more we talk about it, raise awareness, the better chance we have of making real change.
So for people listening, what can they do? Where do we go from here? It can feel kind of overwhelming, like one person can't do much.
No way. Every voice counts. Start by educating yourself. Talk to your friends and family, support groups fighting for criminal justice reform, reach out to your elected officials, and demand change.
Those are great, actionable steps. Don't underestimate your voice. Your vote change starts from the ground up. And this isn't just about rappers or black communities. It's about a fairer, more just society for everyone.
Well said. It's about recognizing we're all human, and injustice anywhere threatens justice everywhere.
Love that. So that wraps up our deep dive today. We've covered a lot from mandatory minimums and TICO laws to how sneaky systemic bias is and the huge difference in how the justice system treats different people.
It's been heavy but important, right? We hope it's made you want to learn more, talk about these things, and fight for a better world.
We're all in this together. By working together, speaking out against injustice, demanding better from our systems, we can create a future where everyone has a fair shot at justice, no matter their race, background, where they're from. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep fighting for a better world.